and welcome. My name is Stephanie Fassler. I am the International Affairs Director and Vice President of Operations for the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. On behalf of the Council and our program partner, the American Academy of Diplomacy, I welcome you to this Author Series event. Many thanks to our strategic partner, the Ronald Reagan Building and International Trade Center, for the use of this venue to hold our public programs. These are filmed for our YouTube channel and are available within 24 hours. Tonight, we welcome to our podium Ambassador Stuart Eizenstat, author of President Carter, The White House Years. Jimmy Carter served as President of the United States from 1977 to 1981. During those 4 years, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, the Camp David Accords were struck between Israel and Egypt, and the Iranian Revolution took place. President Carter's administration made human rights a central feature of his foreign policy. He negotiated the Panama Canal Treaty and the SALT II Nuclear Arms Reduction Treaty. He was both applauded and criticized for handling of these events and the policies he enacted. Looking back at the Carter presidency, what were the accomplishments and failures? What was learned? How did Carter's presidency influence future administrations? What is the continuing impact and legacy of President Jimmy Carter on the United States? As the former chief White House domestic policy advisor to President Carter, Ambassador Eizenstat provides insight to the presidency. Ambassador Eizenstat is currently a partner at the international practice Covington & Burling, LLP. His career in public service spans over 3 administrations, having served in various posts including U.S. Ambassador to the EU, Undersecretary of Commerce for International Trade, Undersecretary of State for Economic, Business, and Agricultural Affairs, and Deputy Secretary of the Treasury. Our discussant, Ambassador Thomas Pickering, is a retired United States ambassador who possesses the highest rank in the Foreign Service, Career Ambassador. Amongst his many postings, Ambassador Pickering served as U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations and Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Stuart Eizenstat and Ambassador Thomas Pickering.
Thank you very much. If I had any sense, I'd really let Tom speak, because there is no more authoritative person living than Tom on foreign policy, and he's been an inspiration for me, and he's very much in the book as well. It's always dangerous to single out people in the audience, but there are some who have really had a very important impact on me, and I want to start by thanking the World Affairs Council, Isabel Del Prado and Stephanie, Ambassador Ron Newsom, the head of the American Academy of Diplomacy, Janan Walker, whose home I stayed at when she was ambassador in Prague, and Tony Wayne, who was my DCM when I was ambassador to the EU, and most especially, and I really have to extend my heart to Richard Gardner, Dick Gardner. Dick was ambassador to Italy in the Carter administration, ambassador to Spain in the Clinton administration. And just one anecdote, when we were starting the campaign in 1975, and it was still Jimmy Who running, Dick Gardner, who was already a distinguished professor at Columbia, had served in the Kennedy administration, came down to Atlanta to help us with a UN speech, and literally and figuratively stayed on our couch in our living room. That's the state of the campaign at that point. So it's very special that he's here, and his daughter Nina as well. Jimmy Carter's political idol was Harry Truman. He brought his famous slogan, "The buck stops here," and put it on his Oval Office desk. Both President Carter and President Truman left the White House highly unpopular. Over the decades, Harry Truman is now remembered much more for his achievements than for his failures. And I hope that my book will have a similar impact on a reassessment of Jimmy Carter as president, not just as an admired former president. He was, in my opinion, the most accomplished one-term president that we've had in modern American history. And that is underscored by the fact that 2 surveys, independent, show that almost 70% of all of our legislative proposals were passed by Congress, just under the percentage of the legendary Lyndon Johnson, who was the first president I served in the White House. Walter Mondale put it very succinctly: we told the truth, we obeyed the law, and we kept the peace. The rap on the Carter presidency can be summarized by several, if you'll excuse my southern accent, I's. Iran, inflation, inexperience by the president and his Georgia mafia, and inter-party warfare with the Kennedy liberal wing of the party. And I do not gloss over these at all in the book. I tackle them head on and in a candid way, as I do the serious foreign policy difference between his dovish Secretary of State, Cy Vance, and his hawkish National Security Advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski. Just one anecdote on that. During the transition, after we beat President Ford, and I was the only one invited by the president to the CIA briefings in planes, during a break, he called me to go outside his house, and he said, "I'm thinking, Stu, of appointing Zbig as National Security Advisor and Cy as Secretary of State." And I said, "Well, you know, I headed all the policy issues during the campaign. I, of course, worked with them both. Either one would be great in their position, but don't appoint both of them together." And he said, "Why?" And I said, "Because they have diametrically opposite views of the central issue we'll be facing, which is how to deal with the Soviet Union." And he said, "I can handle it." Well, I show in the book it was not always handled so well. But having dealt honestly with these problems, the problem is that they have obscured the very real achievements and accomplishments of the president to the extent that they have subsumed them. And what I have tried to do in this book is to give a broader assessment, not ignoring the problems, but talking about the very real achievements that should shine through these very real problems. I want to put you back into the 1970s in which we governed, but to do so, the authenticity of this book, written by a very close senior aide to the president, is based on over 5,000 pages of contemporaneous notes. I've been an inveterate note taker since college, verbatim of every single meeting and telephone call, augmented by over 350 interviews, those who were for Carter, against Carter, Republicans, Democrats, looking over every night note that Secretary Vance sent during his entire tenure and Zbig's weekly reviews. And I really tried to be as candid and honest as I could be. So let's look at the 1970s, this really turbulent period through which we governed, because it was an era of epic change. The post-war centrist consensus had begun to unravel under the pressures of Vietnam, our first military defeat, under the pressures of urban violence, and in addition to those, a whole decade of slow growth and high inflation. Economists had to give it a new name, stagflation. It was a decade in which a whole new set of movements came to the fore that we had to deal with. The environmental movement, the consumer movement, the Black Power movement, the women's rights movement, and yes, the Right to Light movement. It was a decade in which we saw the rise of conservative evangelicals, led by Jerry Falwell, who accused the most religious president we've probably had in modern era of not being a real Baptist and of harboring homosexuals on his staff. And Ronald Reagan, in defeating us in 1980, was able to take that evangelical movement, tether it to the silent majority of Richard Nixon, the dissatisfied blue-collar workers, and create a winning coalition which exists to this very day, and it's the base of President Trump's coalition as well. Foreign affairs also saw a very turbulent decade, as Stephanie began to mention. The Soviet Union, and Tom was an ambassador to Russia, was at the apex of its power and influence. Huge military buildup, new mobile missiles, a navy that was threatening our own, extending its influence through Cuban proxies into Namibia and Angola and elsewhere on the Horn of Africa, supporting, and Dick was in the middle of it, Euro-communism, particularly in Italy, Euro-communist parties, a very aggressive Soviet Union. It also saw the rise of a new power, China, and the first Islamic revolution, one with which every president since has had to inadequately deal with. So let me start by just summarizing briefly our domestic accomplishments, because given this audience, I certainly want to spend time on foreign affairs. The energy security we enjoy today, the reduction of dependence on OPEC oil, is heavily based on the foundation we laid with 3 major energy bills in 4 years, deregulating the price of natural gas and crude oil to encourage production, putting conservation at the center of America's consciousness by insulation credits, but also by emissions and fuel efficiency standards, and inaugurating the new era of clean solar and wind energy, even putting a solar panel symbolically on the White House. And he concluded the most difficult of these negotiations in energy, the natural gas pricing, appropriately in the map room of the White House, where FDR charted the course of World War II, and it sounded, in some ways for us, we were in a war, and with something you would never see today, 2 conservative Republican senators and 2 liberal Democratic members of the House coming together. He was also a great consumer champion, appointing consumer advocates, some from Ralph Nader's Raiders, to regulate industries, not as today taking industry stalwarts to regulate the industries from which they came, and supplanted that with the mandate he gave them with legislation that deregulated and led to competition with railroads, with trucks, over the fierce opposition of the Teamsters, and airlines. Airline deregulation democratized air travel as we know it today. It made possible the entrance of the JetBlues and the Southwests and the UPS and FedEx cargo systems that we take for granted now. And we didn't stop there. We started deregulating telecommunications and inaugurated the new cable era. And even those of you who may be aficionados of local craft beers, we ended prohibition-era restrictions on local craft beers so they could flow as well, all creating more competition. He was the greatest environmental president since Theodore Roosevelt, taking on costly, environmentally damaging water projects, but more significant, literally doubling the size of the national park system that Theodore Roosevelt created through the Alaska Lands Bill over the intense opposition of the congressional delegation from Alaska, which wanted the whole state open for oil and gas exploration. And typically, the way he did it for the final deal was he took a giant map of Alaska, put it on the Oval Office rug, on his hands and knees, sat there with Senator Stevens, a veteran of 25 years, Republican, and pointed out every river, every mountain, what would be in the park and what would not, and amazed Senator Stevens, who said later he knew more about the state than I did representing it for 25 years. Environment is also in the book with Assistant Secretary of State, then Tom Pickering, because Tom authored the Global 2000 report, which was prophetic in its look before anybody knew about global warming, about the dangers to our oceans, the dangers to our forest. This was all part of the Carter legacy. Ethics was another key issue, more important today than ever, We won the election, after all, significantly against Ford on a post-Watergate, I'll never lie to you, people didn't want a new great society. What they wanted is clean and honest government, and he gave it to them, not just in word, but in deed. The 1978 Ethics Act regulated and required disclosure of your assets coming in, gift limits when you were in office, restricted your lobbying when you went out of office. He created the Office of Special Counsel to investigate wrongdoing by high senior officials. Sound familiar? Created inspectors general. There's hardly a day that goes by inspector general reports not in the Post to root out fraud, waste, and abuse. The Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and so forth. Two anecdotes on the 78 Act, one of which I got unwittingly caught up in, the gift limit. So there was a profile of me in a business magazine saying quite inaccurately that I had a great love for the little penny Tootsie Rolls that we may remember when we grew up. And so the Tootsie Roll company sent me a mammoth box, like 3 lifetime supplies of Tootsie Rolls. And I said, I'm going to be father for life to my 2 kids who were then 3 and 7, only to find that the legal counsel felt, he said, I'm damned if I'm going to count every one of these, but even though they're only a penny, it may exceed $25. And so with reluctance, I sent it back with a letter to the CEO explaining our new high ethical standards, only to get bitten by it because about a year later, there was a profile of the Tootsie Roll Company in another magazine. The CEO said Eizenstat tried to have it both ways. He sounded high and mighty in new morality. We opened the box, it was empty. So we're still looking for the Secret Service agent who stole my Tootsie Rolls. More seriously and more relevant, who was the first target of the special counsel? It was Carter's own chief of staff, Ham Jordan, who was accused by the notorious Roy Cohn, the hatchet man for Senator McCarthy, and by the way, early political mentor of Donald Trump, who said that he was snorting cocaine in Studio 54 to try to get his own clients off. It triggered the special counsel. $1 million cost to Ham, diverted him during the campaign. But more significant today, Carter never once tried to interfere with that investigation, never once tried to discredit it, never once tried to intervene, and took his medicine. In addition, here is a Southern president from the Deep South who appointed more women and minorities to senior positions and to judgeships than all 38 presidents before him put together. If anybody's seen the documentary RBG about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, she's quoted in my book of saying, I'm on the Supreme Court because Jimmy Carter put me on the Court of Appeals. He was for affirmative action and minority set-asides, and we saved New York City and Chrysler from bankruptcy. He created the modern vice presidency out of an office of total disrepute. And after we won the election in '76, Mondale gave him a list of 10 requests so that he could become a real partner. Every one of them, Jimmy Carter checked. One-on-one lunches, access to all classified documents, ability to go to any meeting that I want. And then Carter added another one, which was not asked for. He moved him from the executive office building to a prime location in the West Wing, just down from the Oval Office. And everybody knows in politics and in real estate, location is everything. Mondale almost overstepped his bounds because he was so proud of this new office. He had Mike Berman, his legal counsel, go and look at the original architectural plans when the West Wing was built in the early 20th century, and found that that new coveted office had a private bathroom, which he coveted, only to find that during the Nixon era, it had been appropriated by one Henry Kissinger into his National Security Office, and Mondale decided not to get into a fight with Zbig Brzezinski over bathrooms. But as you'll see, and hopefully this will tempt you to ask a question, having been such a partner, one great surprise in my book, and I'm the only Carter aide who knew it, is that he, Mondale, said after the cabinet firing and Malay's speech, I'm resigning, I'm out of here. It's a very dramatic moment recounted in the book. In many ways, I think the most courageous domestic decision that Carter made was also our Achilles heel, which was inflation. We inherited high inflation from Ford and Nixon, and it got worse. and went into the stratosphere with the Iranian Revolution, the cutoff in oil, just like it did when Nixon was president with the OPEC embargo, gas lines and so forth. I had to wait 30 minutes in a gas line to get to the White House to try to solve the gas line problem. It was devastating. And Carter said to us, I've tried everything. Anti-inflation czars, voluntary wage and price guidelines with sanctions, tough budgets that have cut domestic programs and hurt my standing with the liberal wing. Nothing has worked. I'm going to take stiff medicine. Going into a re-election campaign, I'm going to appoint Paul Volcker to head the Federal Reserve, knowing because Volcker told him that he was going to solve inflation the hard way. He was going to choke the economy, choke money supply, raise interest rates, raise unemployment, and squeeze inflation out of the system. Carter never once complained in the midst of an election. Unfortunately, we were not the political beneficiaries. Inflation went dramatically down in the first year or so of the Reagan administration and has been low ever since. It's one of the things I'm most proud of, for which he gets the least credit. And it's emblematic of so much of what we did, which benefited people after we left. Now let's look at foreign policy. Foreign policy had some dramatic, even more dramatic perhaps, successes. Start with Camp David. This was a risky venture, bringing Sadat and Begin together. And for 13 agonizing days and nights, he, the president, wrote himself 20 draft agreements. He negotiated separately with Begin and Sadat because they were like two scorpions in a bottle. You could not put them in the same room. He even negotiated with their staffs. Imagine a president negotiating with staff people. He took them to the Gettysburg battlefield on the first Sunday to dramatize what 5 wars meant and that a 6th one would be a disaster. And then at the end, on the 13th day, we were close but not there. And Begin said, and it was not a bluff, I'm leaving. I've made all the concessions I can. My bags are packed. I've got an El Al plane waiting to take me back. Get me out of here so I can get to it. And Carter knew this would be catastrophic, not just for his own administration, but for the Middle East. It would ruin Sadat's great trip to Jerusalem. And so Carter, having pored over intelligence reports about Begin and Sadat, knew that Begin had a great love for his 8 grandchildren, got their names, individually autographed their photographs, walked over to Begin's cabin, handed him the photographs, and then saw as Begin read each of the grandchildren's names. His lips quiver, tears come to his eyes. He put his book bags down and he said, Mr. President, I'll make one last try. The rest is history. Almost 40 years, that treaty's never been violated. It's critical to Israel's security and to the national interest of the United States. Human rights. We departed sharply from the realpolitik of Kissinger and Nixon, who refused to look at the internal affairs of countries. And Carter saw human rights as the flip side of civil rights. This was not a dewy-eyed, naive policy. It was the first real application of soft power in the midst of the Cold War, when we were competing with the Soviet Union for the hearts and minds of people around the world. We applied it first to the military dictatorships, pro-American, anti-communist in Latin America, cutting off their arms sales, getting thousands of political prisoners released, reaching out to the democratic movements. And there's not a Democrat with a little d in Latin America today who won't tell you that they owe their democracies to what Jimmy Carter did. And we married that to what was the most difficult congressional battle we had, and that was the Panama Canal Treaty, to create a new era in Latin relations with the United States. Again, 2 quick anecdotes. Something, again, you'd never see today. The real hero, beside Carter, of the Panama Canal Treaty was a person very short in stature, but in my opinion, a giant of a leader, 5'7", Howard Baker, the Republican minority leader, who knew he was giving up his chance to be president and get a Republican nomination by doing it, but he did it because it was the right thing to do. And the other less likely hero was none other than Senator Hayakawa, the Republican conservative senator from California, who famously had said, "The canal is ours, we stole it fair and square." And Mondale had worked on him and thought maybe there was a chance that he would flip. Remember, we had to get 2/3 of the Senate. So he puts him on with Carter on telephone in the Oval Office, and the president says, "What can I do to convince you, Senator Hayakawa, to vote for this treaty?" And he said, "Well, Mr. President, here's my demand. I want a regular meeting every 2 weeks in the Oval Office to talk to you broadly about foreign policy and give you my expert advice." And the president says, "Oh, Senator, I wouldn't want to limit you to just 2 weeks." So flattered he was, he flipped his vote. Carter never had to see him again. We also embraced human rights against the Soviet Union, again, its soft underbelly. We reached out to the Soviet Jewish movement, to Sharansky, and in his own book, he said, "You saved my life by saying I wasn't a spy." In the first week, Tom, of the administration, as we were beginning SALT negotiations, we get a letter from Andrei Sakharov, the head of the Democratic Dissident Movement, saying, "Please stand with us." I remember the drama of deciding, what do we do? How is it going to influence SALT? He responded and said, "I'm with you." And we applied, in addition, hard power. And this is, again, a surprise in the book. Everybody thinks Carter was weak on defense. We increased defense spending 3%, and a new Pentagon study, an exhaustive study, shows that we laid the foundation for all of Reagan's defense buildup. The MX missile, the stealth bomber, all of these were green-lighted in our administration. And that's critically important to understand that we had both soft and hard power and applied to the Soviet Union. China, Nixon and Kissinger get all the credit they should in the opening to China. But they didn't establish diplomatic relations with China. Why? Because the Taiwan lobby, which was obviously against it, was a key component of the Republican coalition. We did. We took it on. It was a bloody battle. The Taiwan Relations Act was a result. And I was in the cabinet room for the first meeting when little Deng Xiaoping, 4'11", I remember seeing him saying, how could he control 1 billion people? He gets into the cabinet room and he thanks the president for diplomatic relations and then says, now what I really want, this may sound very current, is I want to make sure that our Chinese products get the lowest tariff levels that you extend to anybody else. And he said, no, I know the law, I know the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, which is aimed at the Soviet Union and doesn't let them have that because they restrict immigration. And he says, we don't restrict immigration. He takes a little White House notepad, had the White House on it with a pencil, pushes it over to the president and says, now, Mr. President, you write down the number of Chinese you would like us to send you each year, 1 million, 10 million? And Carter, laughing, says, I'll tell you what, we'll make a deal right now. I will take 10 million Chinese a year if you'll take 10,000 American journalists. Neither had to fulfill that commitment. I want to talk briefly about Europe and then go to what was the coup de grace Iran. We valued our relationship with Europe. Carter felt that by strengthening our allies, we strengthened ourselves. We did not pit Europe against ourselves. We didn't try to weaken Europe. Of course we had differences, but we viewed them as valued allies who had the same Western values of democracy and tolerance and free speech that we wanted to promote around the world. If you look at what happened in Quebec at the Canadian summit, the polar opposite happened in 1979 in Bonn with the Bonn summit, in which we harmonized, and two experts, Bob Putnam at Harvard and Randall Henning, have done a study saying this was the most consequential G7 summit ever. We harmonized with Germany and with France and others our energy policy, our trade policy, our economic policy. It was a tour de force. And again, one funny anecdote, we basically solved the Tokyo round there, and Bob Strauss, who was not known for understatement, he was our trade representative. Giscard d'Estaing said, "Ambassador Strauss, you trade people brag too much." And Strauss said at the G7, there's a famous expression by a pitcher named Dizzy Dean, "If you done it, it ain't bragging." And Giscard called his translator over and said, "Who is this Dizzy Dean? What is he talking about?" And the UK, the British Prime Minister Callaghan, whose mother came from St. Louis, said Dizzy Dean was a famous pitcher for the 1934 world champion St. Louis Cardinals. It was a really quite hysterical scene. So the G7 was important. Now let me talk about pluses and minuses with Europe, because it was not all rosy at all. The great success we had at the G7, just the opposite occurred with the neutron bomb. The neutron bomb was called by its opponents a Frankenstein weapon. Its great virtue was that it killed people with its fission and left the buildings intact. You might think it should be the other way around, but okay, that was the neutron bomb. Carter had reluctance about it from a moral standpoint, a proliferation standpoint, but he got funding for it, and then laid a condition down which he was sure the Europeans would never take, which is, you have to accept this publicly. I'm not going to just impose it on you. And he knew that would be a non-starter. Well, the fact was that Brzezinski, Harold Brown, our defense secretary, and Sy, through patient negotiations, actually got them to do it, and they presented this thing to Carter with great fanfare, saying, "This is great." And Carter said, "Damn it, why didn't you tell me you were this far along?" He canceled the summit, he canceled the neutron bomb, and I interviewed Schmidt, the chancellor, who told me afterward, Carter, made me look like a fool after I'd gotten out on a limb. A more positive aspect with both Schroeder and the Europeans, or with both Schmidt and the Europeans, was with intermediate nuclear weapons. Just as controversial, there were anti-Carter demonstrations for both, but there we got an agreement to implement the intermediate nuclear forces in Europe. It was very, very, very difficult, because they said, you guys are standing behind the Atlantic Ocean. We now have nuclear weapons right on Russia's door, but we got them to do it. And Gorbachev said in his memoirs afterward, this one decision convinced me that we could not compete with the United States. So it was a very, very consequential thing. Now let's go to Iran. And here I'm sort of in an unmitigating way negative about everything that happened. For 444 humiliating days, a very old and supposedly unsophisticated radical Islamic cleric, Ayatollah Khomeini, outwitted the entire U.S. government. And in violation of every diplomatic principle, held our own diplomats on our own sovereign soil. Now, it was, in my opinion, the single worst intelligence failure in modern American history, even perhaps more than the so-called weapons of mass destruction in Iran. The CIA, which had reinstalled the Shah in 1953, and 6 presidents had given him tens of billions of dollars of our more sophisticated arms. The CIA did not know that the Shah's political support at home rested on quicksand. They didn't know that for 5 years, our principal ally was getting cancer treatments. They didn't know that Khomeini sending these cassettes to Iran was having the kind of impact of stirring up the revolution. Catastrophic mistake. After the hostages were taken, Carter had a seminal decision to make. Brzezinski and I both recommended military action, not dropping a bomb, but mining the harbors off of Karg Island, where 60% of all of Iran's lifeblood, its oil, was coming from, to immediately show that this was unacceptable. Carter, on the other hand, met with the hostage families, was sort of moved by them, and said, my #1 priority is to get your loved ones back safely. And he did, but at huge cost. Negotiations lasted, again, 444 days, and he made an additional mistake of holding himself up on the White House, canceling his foreign travel, canceling campaigns to try to show he was working on this to the exclusion of everything else, and that meant the press looked at it to the exclusion of everything else. The Ted Koppel Nightline show was invented because of this. Walter Cronkite, the Dean of American Reporting, every single night closed his broadcast. Day 105 of the House race, day 306, day 407. It was absolutely devastating. And our administration went up in flames with the ill-conceived Desert One rescue effort. Not because there were too few helicopters. Carter actually added helicopters to the minimum the military wanted, but because there was no joint command, they had not coordinated as they do now. And so it was the right hand not knowing what the left hand was doing, and when that helicopter hit the C-130 cargo plane, killing 8 of our servicemen, it was like the worst day imaginable. And the flames from that terrible incident engulfed our whole administration. There's no question in my mind it was a seminal decision. Now, my book is not just about policy, it's about people. And I have very, I hope, interesting profiles that you will enjoy if you read the book. I'll mention just one or two because time doesn't permit more. His mother, Miss Lillian, was a marvelous woman, a young registered nurse when he was just a child, caring for black and white people in rural southwest Georgia, unheard of. Age 68, enters the Peace Corps in India, and was very, of course, assertive in defending her son during his run for president. A New York reporter comes down to interview her, and of course, our signal line was, "I will not lie to you," and the New York reporter says, "Now you can't tell me, Miss Lillian, that your son never lied." "Oh, of course he did. He told white lies all the time." "Well, what do you mean by white lies?" "Well, you know when I said to you how wonderful it is to see you in planes? That was a white lie." One of my favorite characters is Russell Long, who was the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee and whose father was the famous kingfish in All the King's Men, the Governor Huey Long of Louisiana. And there's a story I'll tell you during the question period, but the one I want to talk about is he was chief of staff also to Uncle Earl. That was his father's brother. And he told the following story, that Uncle Earl was facing a tough re-election campaign, and Russell was his chief of staff. He calls all the parish leaders in and says, "Boys, we've got to get the vote out. This is going to be a tough re-election." And he promises everything, buildings and roads and bridges. And after the election, which he wins, they all come lining up waiting for their payoff. And Russell knows there's not enough money 10 times going to pay for these. And he goes in to see his Uncle Earl, and he says, "Uncle Earl, what must I say to them?" "Russell, it's very simple. Just tell them your Uncle Earl lied." So that was the kind of politics that he came from. And he was a master of trading votes. I think he would trade a key vote for his mother, and couldn't understand why this moralistic Southern president wouldn't deal with him in the same way. Now, of course, the principal player is Jimmy Carter himself. Here's someone who comes from a gnat-infested 500-person hamlet in southwest Georgia. And I say gnat-infested. He's the only one I ever saw who didn't brush the gnats away. Somehow he was inured to them. And he makes his way to the White House. How? First, through unbelievably indefatigable campaigning, 100 days in Iowa alone, but also, and more important, he alone among the Democratic candidates understood that what the public wanted was the anti-Washington, anti-Watergate ethical outsider. And he produced that. He was in many ways the first new Democrat, fiscally conservative, progressive on race and poverty issues, a liberal internationalist who believed in the liberal order, a free trader. And in many ways, he was a centrist, too conservative for the liberals, too liberal for the conservatives. He fell right between the cracks. But in saying that, he also left, I think, a very important legacy. in giving you this story of the book, do not nominate him for Mount Rushmore. But I do believe that he belongs in the foothills of Mount Rushmore as one of the presidents who made seminal accomplishments, who made this country a better country, who made the world a better world, and that's the basic argument of my book. Thank you.
I'm honored and pleased to join you all tonight, and thank you, Stu, for the invitation to be here. In that sense, it's special to me to have an opportunity to say a few words. You talked a great deal about what you, with a decade-plus hard labor, put in the book. And in many ways, that's the seminal and really interesting stuff. I joined the club, and it's a growing club that's read all 902 pages, Stu. And I have to say, it is beautifully written. I listened and watched, but in many ways was completely attracted by the way you set down what it was you had to tell us about this particular period in our nation's history from the viewpoint of someone who perhaps in the most unusual way had access that probably rarely, if ever, will be repeated. There are 3 or 4 things that I think about the book that you ought to know from someone who's read it over. I think that given Stu's access, his notes, his interviews, and his direct relationship, this is a unique history of an American presidency which, with respect to the Carter presidency, I believe will never be repeated or equaled, given the information at Stu's hand and the sensitivity with which he portrayed it. I think as well, every great presidential history is a work that couples both the historical and important stories, lives, and activities with a commentary. And I think that, again, because of Stu's unique position, his deep understanding of what was going on, and the remarkable material he had at his grasp, he's probably the best commentator on the Carter presidency that we could have. And immediately that will swing your thinking to the question, was Stu objective? Was Stu fair? Was Stu open to the notion that he was looking at a presidency like every presidency, which had a combination of splendid achievements and serious problems? And I can tell you, I can think of no one who could have written a history with a greater sense of objectivity, both about himself and his own role. And in many ways, Stu's a man of humility, but is not afraid to put forward in print his concern about those areas where his misjudgments in one way or another were clearly Stu catalogable. And where the president who he served, who he admired greatly, and who I think we all who worked with him during and after his presidency thought a great deal of. But Stu was not afraid to call it the way he saw it and not pull his punches on the places where he thought this president both succeeded but also failed. An extremely unusual book for Washington in our current time and day and age, a book that runs counter to what we see, feel, and hear at every moment in terms of the conduct of an administration, which may be as far away from Stu's book, its objectivity, and the way in which he called the shots that took place that he saw both up and down. I think there's a number of other things that should be said about the book, and I'll try to be brief. One of these is the remarkable characterization of individuals. And Stu mentioned a couple that he's particularly attracted to. But I would say, as you read the book, look at the chapter on Rosalind Carter, and look at Stu's portrayal of Walter Mondale throughout. Both, I think, absolutely fascinating indications of a man who deeply understood what was going on around him and the essentiality of these two players in a very real way to some of the critical decisions that had to be made. And I think that part was deeply important. I think finally, all of us who in one way or another are chained to the interest that we have in foreign and security policy will find those chapters of this book absolutely fascinating. Stu's intimate contact with a number of Iranians that I had never heard of, but he had met, gives you vignettes into the Iranian views about how the crisis of the 440 days took place, unfolded, and played out. The notes, the information, the ideas conveyed, and the history of Camp David is a spellbinding and indeed absolutely fascinating review of a negotiation which held those engaged in the negotiation in suspended animation for the 13 days of that particular peace. And the story of the pictures signed by the president that made a huge difference in Menachem Begin's outlook and willingness to go not just the last mile, but the last mile beyond that, is in itself a remarkable piece of writing, but an absolutely stunning piece of information. And history books, by their covers and size, are often off-putting. I urge you not to let that be a problem for yourself. It takes time to read and absorb, but I found every page absolutely fascinating. Nothing jumped out at me that was in any way a salient example of bad writing. Someone who can maintain that degree of skill, that degree of sensitivity of portrayal, and that degree of wise selection of language deserves something on the literary side. Stu, I hope comes your way. But thank you for the chance just to say those few words, because in every sense of the word, it was an honor to be here, but an honor to read the book and an honor to convey my thoughts about it to you tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. I can only say how touched I am, because I think all of us know that Tom is, the premier public servant of our time, and it's much appreciated. I do want to say one thing with Richard Gardner here. One of the great things we did in our transatlantic relations, you can't imagine how close Italy came to being communist. And the fact that it was not, and that we reversed the tide, was due to Richard Gardner and his remarkable knowledge of the Italians, his fluency with the language, and his ability to go straight to the president to get his support. And Dick, we really rolled back, because of you, this whole Euro-communism movement in Western Europe, and you deserve all the credit that I try to give you in the book. If you want to ask any questions.
I do, Stu. There are a number of questions. What piece of the book did you find yourself not only as a key player, but particularly attached to as something that you perhaps had salient influence over and found as well to be a kind of policy achievement that you took special pleasure in?
Well, that's a good question. I think in terms of policy, it really would be, I mentioned deregulation and so forth. I really think it was the energy policy, because I really believe it was transformative. and really began to reduce our dependence on foreign oil, number one. Number two, I come from a minority. I mean, I'm Jewish. To see a Southern president be so pro-civil rights, the famous Bakke case on affirmative action, which we came down in favor of over the objection of our own Attorney General, who was a conservative from Georgia, knowing that it would hurt our base in the South, was very courageous. I would say that there were one or two other personal items that were most affecting to me. One was the Mondale situation. So Mondale and I were intensely close. I suppose we were the sort of liberal conscience of the administration. We had an unusual relationship in that I was the chief domestic policy advisor to the President of the United States. And yet Mondale felt comfortable about calling me in and sort of bearing his concerns. We would go in at the end of every budget cycle, before OMB would send the budget up. All the appeals were done. And Fritz and I had $1 billion to $2 billion of domestic cuts that OMB had made that we felt were like Head Start and so forth, important to add back. It was that kind of intimacy. But here's what happens. So he's a full partner in the most amazing ways. We have a meeting at Camp David that came as close to violence as anything I've ever seen in government. So Carter comes back from the G7 in Tokyo, totally exhausted. We have an energy speech prepared for him. It would have been his fifth. And he says, I'm not giving it. People have tuned me out. And he retreats to camp. We all said, how do you do that? You know, it's already been announced. What reason do we give? The reason is the President of the United States is not going to give the speech, period. So he goes to Camp David, and he, for 10 days, has the wise men and wise women come to give him advice about how to write his presidency. The most humorous advice was by a 32-year-old first-term governor from Arkansas. I'll let you guess who it was, who said, Mr. President, here's your problem. You should love people and be positive and love politics. You're always down. You're always talking about turning the thermostats down. Be upbeat. I'll let you guess who that future president was. But at the end of the day, we now have seen all these people. We have to write a speech. And this is where the drama occurs. Mondale and I are on one side of the same table at which the Camp David Accords were drafted, a huge table at Holly Lodge. And on the other side is his 29-year-old Wonder King pollster, Pat Caddell, who had a sort of Rasputin impact on Rosalynn and Carter and on the political staff, and convinced them that the real problem with Carter's polls, which was so low, was that we had a narcissistic society. This was a book he had read, and that Americans cared too much about themselves and not about the country. And Mondale, he's an understated Norwegian. I mean, the veins bulged. If it wasn't a big table, he would have choked Caddell. He said, this is just high school poppycock. The reason why we are low in popularity is because people can't get gas. It's because there's double-digit inflation. It's because there's slow growth. So he was just beside himself. Carter took him for a walk around Camp David to cool him off. It didn't work. Finally, he gives the speech. Never mentions malaise, but we sort of toned it down, and we said the way to end this crisis of confidence was to get together on energy. So we sort of stapled together the old speech I had done. Well, much to my shock, the speech is an incredible success. 17% increase in the polls. We found an older lady who was in the mail room of the White House. She was working in the bowels of the executive office. She had been there since FDR's days. She said, I've never seen such letters coming from the public. They're not just postcards. You touched us, Mr. President. So then what happens is Carter decides, without telling Fritz, the only time, and me, that he's going to have the whole cabinet resign. And I was sitting next to Ann Wexler when I said, if this were a parliamentary system, people would think the government has fallen. Mondale finds out about it when he's campaigning for SALT II in Tennessee, and he reads it on the wire. He was beside himself. So he calls me up when he comes back, and he said, Stu, I've got to see you, just you and me. We're going to have lunch at the Moon Palace Chinese restaurant. I think it may still be there, opposite the National Cathedral on Wisconsin Avenue. And I know why he chose it, because there was nobody there, and if you ate the food, you would know why it was empty. And he says to me, he says, I cannot stand this anymore. This is amateur hour. I don't want to be associated with it. I am leaving. I said, you can't do that. A vice president's never resigned. He actually had his legal counsel, Mike Berman, look into the legality of it. Then his fallback was, okay, I won't leave, but I won't be on the ticket. In the end, he didn't. But, I mean, it was a dramatic, dramatic period. And last time would be the Iranian situation. I mean, it preoccupied everything. It drained all the energy. And trying to get Carter out of this notion of holding himself up. So I wanted, because I wasn't involved in all the Iranian policy, I was involved in the sanctions. I led the sanctions effort. I wanted to understand from the Iranian standpoint what they were thinking. And so I found the former chief of staff of Khomeini when he was in exile outside of Paris. Aviv was from vacations in France. It's a little place called Noufali, about 30 minutes outside of Paris. And I found what he was really doing, how he looked, how he prayed, how he interacted. I talked to the son-in-law of the foreign minister. So it gave me a real perspective of and why was it we reached many agreements to release the hostages. Every time we reached an agreement, Khomeini vetoed it, every single time. Why did he wait until 1 minute after the Carter presidency ended to take the hostage? Because he hated Carter. He saw Carter, ironically, as the embodiment of support for the Shah. And that really comes through, I think, in the book.
Stu, just two quick questions. One, Iran was probably the nadir of foreign policy accomplishment, if those two words go together. What was, in your view, the height, the zenith, of the foreign policy achievements of Carter?
Well, I think there were two or three, which I mentioned. The first was Camp David and the treaty. People think, when they think of peace with Egypt, of Camp David. Camp David was a framework agreement. It was not a binding treaty, and it called for a binding treaty within 3 months. Well, 3 months went by, 4 months went by, 5 months went by, total impasse. They can't reach an agreement on the treaty. Carter, over the objection of every single person, travels to the region to try to put it together again. And just like Begin almost walked out of Camp David, we have this incredible scene where after 3 or 4 days of shuttle diplomacy, he's gotten Sadat to agree, but not Begin. We ended up having to work around Begin with Diane and so forth, but okay, we cannot get him to agree. Carter has his bags packed. It's he that's got his bags packed. He's in the presidential suite of the King David. The airspace was cleared for Air Force One to leave. He and Rosalind were packing and dressing. All of a sudden, Begin calls him up early in the morning and says, Mr. President, I want to see you before you leave. Well, Carter thought, well, okay, it's just a courtesy. So he asks us to entertain Begin while he's getting dressed. And Begin says, now, boys, you know, the King David Hotel has a special meaning to me. It's a very famous hotel. And we said, well, we know it's famous. He says, no. It's famous because I blew it up when the British were here. And there's a great scene about them reaching an agreement, coming down, the elevator breaks, and they had to be taken out, as Carter said, butt first to reach an agreement. So, I mean, I think, Tom, this had such a dramatic impact. It's been followed to a T, and even now in the northern Sinai, when Egypt has problems with the terrorists, they ask permission from the Israelis to put their troops just above the red line. And so I think that was a high point. The China normalization, the human rights policies, which I think had a real impact on Latin American democracy and on the Soviet Union. I think all of those were real foreign policy high points.
Stu, my final question, I think you know what it is. What was the hardest piece of this for you to write?
The hardest piece for me to write was the book itself in the following sense. It was to be candid, brutally honest about his mistakes and mine, and yet at the same time to use the book as a way of a positive reassessment of the president, of trying to strike, Tom, that balance without being wishy-washy. And I also determined when I first wrote the book, my colleague David Rubenstein, who's now the founder of the Carlyle Group, was my deputy, and he said, you should have called the book If He'd Only Listened to Me. Well, I wanted to make sure that no one could say about this book if he only listened to me, because in many areas like inflation and so forth, I was wrong.
The point you make, I think, is extremely interesting because the candor, the objectivity, is really, in a way, an internal balancing element to the notion that Carter, up until now, in terms of historical treatment, probably deserved better. I think you felt that, and you made the very strong case. And in fact, the analogy with Harry S. Truman, who went through much of the same, is, I think, a real piece. And you don't put Carter and Mount Rushmore. And that obviously may be something that I wonder if President Carter enjoyed that immensely.
Well, I mean, I think he did, because he finally realized, it took him a little while, to appreciate the fact that if I hadn't been warts and all, that the book wouldn't have been accepted. But I want to make two other points related to your question. The first is, Peter Baker in the New York Times gave a great review on Sunday, but he said something that I think validates what I tried to do, and that is, he said I turned a two-dimensional president into a three-dimensional president. So you see him for all of his facets, his strengths and his weaknesses. And last, I wanted the book to be about the 1970s, about the decade of 70s, but I also wanted it to be a book not just about Jimmy Carter, but about the American presidency, about the tremendous pressures, the hothouse atmosphere, the conflicting interest groups that come at you every day and every night, the options which, oftentimes are all bad options, and the difficulty of making decisions in an administration, and the way to make good administration. He was criticized for excessive attention to detail, demanding the appendices to the decision memos. And I sort of went along with that for a while, but then over the years, including now, I'm wondering if that's such a bad way to govern, to make sure you've read everything before you make a decision, before you send a tweet out.
Well, there's always the President Reagan 3x5 card.
And the 3x5 cards.
But one of the interesting things is, Stu, and I think we've all noticed this, in the period since President Carter has left the presidency, I think if there's a Mount Rushmore for ex-presidents, he probably will be there.
There is, but I give like a page to the post-presidency, because I didn't want to fall into the trap of saying, remember, he's a great former president.
Yeah. But one of the things that I think you might want to look at, or maybe leave to your sons or to others, Jimmy Carter after the presidency, the post-White House years.
And many of the things that the Carter Center stands for, disease control in Africa, I mean, they've cured two diseases, guinea worm and river blindness, the emphasis on overseeing democratic elections, non-proliferation. Those were things they didn't just come out of the blue. They were very much part of his own administration.
We'll take some questions from the audience. Would people
Yes, please.
address us from the microphone? If you have a question, hop over there.
We have about 10 minutes, so if
Yeah.
you can take about 3 or 4 questions. Please.
Thank you. Bill Courtney from the RAND Corporation. In the popular psyche, the strategic military buildup opposite the Soviet Union began under the Reagan administration. But in fact, it began in the second half of the Carter administration with the long-term defense program in 1978, which pledged all the NATO allies to increase defense spending to 3% of GDP. And then the next year, the INF, the Theater of Nuclear Forces decision, as you pointed out. Do you have a sense of why Reagan got all the credit?
Yes, this
and
is a
was
good
this
question.
frustrating? Yeah.
It's really a good question because the military buildup, as you probably said, it started in the second half, and then the Afghan invasion. We talk about a tough policy. I mean, the Afghan invasion, arming the Mujahideen, the Olympic boycott in Moscow, and we all had the Berlin Olympics in our mind. The grain embargo 3 weeks before the Iowa primaries, increasing defense spending 5% as a result of that. I mean, all of these things. Now, the question is, why didn't that resonate? Okay, I think there's two things. Americans like winners and they don't like losers. When you lose an election, you are a failure. And all the good things sort of get cast aside. Second, he campaigned in '76 as a liberal. He was going to cut the defense budget by $5 to $7 billion from Ford's level. He was going to pull troops out of South Korea. And then one seminal decision, by the way, over my objection, that he made early in the administration set the tone for this so-called anti-defense profile, and that was the B-1 bomber. He decided to kill the B-1 bomber and instead to put cruise missiles in. It was highly unpopular, so much so that instead of telling Harold Brown himself, he asked me to go over to see Harold Brown and tell him at the Pentagon. So I think it was a combination of all of those, and I think it was the Iran issue. I think if we had shown some real military muscle, we would have a very different posture. Instead, it looked like this third-rate country was holding, the President of the United States hostage, that we couldn't find a way to get our own hostages out. And the irony is that he got a message through the Swiss to the Ayatollah saying, if any of our hostages are put on a phony trial, or if they're harmed in any way, or if their health is impaired, I will use military action. And it didn't happen. Well, if it didn't happen then, why not say, you got to release them or it'll happen? So I think it's a combination of those reasons.
Another question, sir?
Yes. Hi, my name is Patrick Realisa, and I'm a member of the World Affairs Council here in Washington, D.C. Thank you both for your insight. I wanted to ask both of you for your insight on the current state of foreign diplomacy for the United States, if you can comment on that. As a young professional here in D.C. looking to
I didn't write this book, obviously, to be any Trump book, and when I wrote it, started researching it, which was 1981, at Brookings when I went over my 103 legal pads, nobody could have imagined Trump. I think the biggest differences are, first, Carter believed in the importance of our allies. He believed in working with allies, working differences out, and that our allies strengthened us rather than weakened us. I think, second, he would not have imposed unilateral tariffs against Canada and Mexico and the EU and our closest allies. Really believed that it was important to work with them. So, I think in the broadest macro sense, it really was the notion that your allies were valuable, that the G7 and the democratic countries were valuable, and the whole human rights thing, again, look, no one can be pure on human rights. We gave the Shah a pass. People think, well, no, some of the people say, you're the one that caused the Shah to be in exile. Well, damn it, can you say that we were any more responsible for that than the fact that 90 miles from the United States, Castro came to power when Eisenhower was there? So, we made massive mistakes, but this, I think it wasn't one of them. But I think the application of human rights was a tremendously important thing. But again, it was not universal. We largely gave the Shah a pass. We gave some others a pass. But we did apply it, both to the right and to the left, and it had dramatic movements. And now we're back to the realpolitik of the Nixon-Kissinger era, and then some.
Let me just say one other thing. At the other end, how are we treating our diplomatic personnel? What are we doing with respect to keeping them on board rather than pushing them out the door? I think Secretary Pompeo has shown a real interest in that. I first to disagree with his policies, but I think the restoration, and I hope he's going to be deeply involved in it, of the State Department and its personnel strength and dealing with the issues that he has. We have now increased our intake for the next year to 300 to 400 as against 100 for 2017.
Yes, and I think it is absolutely right. I think Pompeo has reinvigorated the State Department.
But the second thing is that the House numbers now on the 2019 budget are exactly the numbers that were on the 2017 budget, which rejects all of the proposed cuts, and that's come out of the Congress. And the fascinating thing is Lindsey Graham, who was not the greatest fan of the American Foreign Service, is now writing articles in defense of the Foreign Service and not cutting it. So the Congress has jumped in its own kind of strange way. And this is, kind of anti whatever else has been going on in terms of polarization in things like, well, we only have one State Department, we can't afford to lose it. And that, I think, is an important piece of what we see going on. And a lot of people have worked hard to do that. It doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen, through kind of osmosis. Yeah. But it is important that people now feel strongly enough that this is a public issue of some concern that, put it this way, even the Congress is taking an interest in it.
One other thing that's important is the continuity of policy. So, to his great credit, after we negotiated the SALT II arms control agreement, it was never ratified by the Senate. Ronald Reagan implemented it faithfully during its entire duration. Contrast that with the Iran deal, with Paris, with TPP. It's very important to try to keep a continuity of policy so when you reach an agreement internationally, the other side knows that when another president comes in, it's going to be maintained.
And as you know, because you and I talked about this, President Carter's institution in a serious way of real concern about human rights and foreign policy. Administration after administration has kept it. This hasn't been, in a sense, a Democratic stepchild or a Republican stepchild. It's become part of national policy, even to the extent that it continues this day.
And the president in Venezuela, to his credit,
exactly.
Trump's credit, has applied it.
It very much.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you very much for the great insight that you gave us into President Carter's presidency. As an Iranian citizen, I do wonder that why do you think President Carter did not take any more extreme measures or actions towards Iran and Khomeini's regime at that time? I am wondering that was it an ethical decision or political decision?
No, it was an ethical decision. I think it was the wrong decision. His concern was, and Ham Jordan put it in the following way, if we try to exercise our muscle, the hostages will come home, but they may come home in coffins. I don't believe that for a minute. Khomeini was in the early part of his tenure. His own standing was uncertain. I think had we shown some real military muscle right at the beginning, we would not have been in this humiliating standoff for 444 days. But I think it was Carter's humanity toward, making sure that the number one priority was getting the hostages out. I think, again, you could have had your cake and eat it too, because the best way to get them out safely was to show military muscle. They knew it would have been World War III if they had started killing the hostages. Okay, so I will, as we close, I should have said this as we started the question period, tell you one last Huey Long story that's in the book. Russell was then a young boy. His father's the governor of Louisiana. He says, Papa comes home stone cold drunk one night and with great difficulty gets the key in the keyhole to a line and then collapses in the foyer of the governor's mansion. And Russell, a young boy, is holding on to Mama's apron strings as she looks down at her husband to try to get an explanation as to how this state of affairs could have occurred to the governor of the great state of Louisiana. And Russell said, Daddy said, Mama, I've completed my prepared remarks and I'll now take questions from the floor. So that's what we've been doing with only water, I can assure you. Thank you all for coming.